One brisa said that by tsaras, the Torah says that the only types of material that can become tameh is wool or linen. And from that we learn that af kol, also anywhere else where the Torah speaks about clothing, about material, it's only speaking about wool and linen. Now seemingly that would mean tumas shrotzim. Other tumas, if a dead creature touched a clothing, the Torah says that a clothing becomes tameh. So this teaches us that only wool and linen. The problem is there's a different brisa of the same yeshiva, Tanat Beit Rabbi Shmuel, which says the exact opposite. That by shrotzim, it says an extra word, oy beged, which tells us all clothing, all materials become tameh. So how do we solve this contradiction? So we had one way, a second way, which we pushed away. Now we're trying to solve it in the third way. It's the same idea like Rav Papa said, that af kol will be referring to something else. It will not be referring to tumas shrotzim. It will be referring to a total different halacha. Which halacha? Tzitzis. It says that you should have tzitzis on the four corners of your clothing. But it doesn't say which material comes. Dinei nigoyim, the dinim of teras of clothing tells us, when the Torah tells us simply a clothing, it's referring to wool and linen. And only wool and linen need to have tzitzis v'natir. Let's see. Rav Nachman bar Yitzchak Omar af kol. When the Brisa says, the first Talmud Beit Rabbi Shmuel says, also everything else is only wool and linen. What does everything else mean? Lasuya comes to add tzitzis. Says the Gemara, tzitzis. Behen yiksiv. There's a clear pasuk which says, not a clear pasuk, but a clear limud from a pasuk, that tzitzis, that the only clothing you have to put tzitzis is wool and linen. It says, "Leisil ba'shatnes, don't wear shatnes tzemer or pishtim, wool and linen." Uchsiv, and it says right afterwards, "Gedilim ta'asalach." You should make fringes. You should make tzitzis on the corners of your clothing. So what do we see from here? That it's samuch. It's one next to the other. So from samuchim we learn out that which clothing do you put tzitzis, wool or linen? So you don't need the pasuk of negoim. You can learn it now from the fact that it was put one next to the other, shatnes and tzitzis. Says the Gemara, no, I wouldn't necessarily learn from that pasuk. So kedai tachamina, I would have thought kedirava. We could follow Rava's way of learning. The Rava had a steer. Ksiv, in one pasuk it says hakonof. You should put tzitzis, put the tcheles on the tzitzis which is on the corner. Obviously it's on the corner. The pasuk already earlier said that you should put the tzitzis on the corners of your clothing. So why do you have to say and put the tcheles on the tzitzis which is on the corner? Min hakonof. It comes to teach us that what type of thread should you put on the corners of a clothing? The same material as the clothing itself. That's what we see in one pasuk. In a different pasuk it says, in other words, right before tzitzis it says wool and linen, and he learns out from that it comes to teach us that the tzitzis, the threads, should be made out of wool or linen. Not what we said earlier, that the clothing, if it's made out of wool or linen, it's chayiv tzitzis, but that the threads must be made from wool or linen. So he has a problem. He didn't even bring up the svara, the havamina, that only clothes made out of wool or linen should have to have tzitzis. That's out of the question, man. He understood from the fact that these two psukim are close to each other, that tzitzis has to be made, the threads have to be made out of wool or linen. But another pasuk says you make a thread the same material as the clothing. So how do we solve the mystery? So the answer is, okay, so says Rava, tzemer upishtim, wool or linen, poitrim, bein b'minan, min shaloi b'minan. No matter what the material is, if you make threads, if you make tzitzis out of wool or linen, it's potter. You were yotze the mitzvah of tzitzis. Shar minim, threads made out of any other material. B'minan poitrim. If you put it on a clothing made out of the same exact material, it's fine. Shaloi b'minan. If it's not the same material, ain't poitrim, then it's you weren't yotze the mitzvah. So what do we see? That Rava never even learned that that the clothing has to be out of wool or linen. He learned that the threads have to be out of wool or linen. So therefore, it's not so clear from that smuchim, from the fact that these two psukim are close to each other, it's not so clear that only tzemer upishtim clothing is chayiv b'tzitzis. So Kadaitach, I would have thought Kidin Rava, that we should learn like Rava, and every single type of material is chayiv b'tzitzis min ha-Torah. Kamash Malon comes Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak and tells us, no, you're right. From the closest of the two psukim, I wouldn't have known that. Lav Davke, it could be it's coming to teach us that the rest have to be wool or linen. But from Nigoyim, from Tsaras, I could learn that wherever the Torah speaks about clothing, it's talking about wool or linen. So what are we now going to do with all these psukim, with the fact that these psukim are close to each other and min hakonav? So like this. 1 second. Okay, smuchim. I don't know if you have to learn out something from, because whatever it's not an extra pasuk. Hakonov, he'll come to say something different. He says it's that pshat in the pasuk. Put on the tzitzis, which is similar to the corner, put a blue thread or two blue threads according to Rashi. What does that mean? He's trying to point out the difference. Tzitzis threads are typically white, and a clothing is also typically white. So typically the first threads of tzitzis are hakonov, they're the same color as the clothing. Put on top of that threads from a different color, from the blue, from the tchelas. So the Torah is pointing out the contrast. This is white, like the clothing, and this is blue. But it's not coming to teach us that you could put threads from the same type of clothing, because the only types of materials we have is wool or linen. So obviously the threads should be wool or linen. And obviously we shouldn't put linen on wool unless it's tchelas. And if it's tchelas, it has to be wool. So there's no reason to tell us that the thread should be the same type as the clothing. So therefore, he doesn't have any of the limudim of Rava, but the closeness of the two parshiyos, the fact that they're put close to each other, does not teach me that only wool or linen is chayiv b'tzitzis. So we have to learn it out from tzaras of clothes. Fine. That's that. So we had Rava's answer, possibly, that the first Tanna Dvei Rabbi Shmuel that says that other clothing is not tummy, is talking about between 3x3 etzvos and 3x3 tfachim. The Braisa, which says that it does apply to other clothing, is talking about 3x3 tfachim and onwards. That's Rava's explanation, maybe. Rav Papa's explanation that it's coming, that it's af kol is not talking about shrotzim. Shrotzim take would apply to all clothing, because it says oy beged. Av kol is coming to tell me that shatnez is only wool or linen, but we pushed that off. We didn't accept that answer. Then we have Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, which tells us that af kol, what we learn from Tzaras is that only clothing made out of wool or linen is chayiv b'tzitzis. And I would not have learned that out from the fact that shatnez and tzitzis are written one next to the other, because from there I might have learned that threads made out of tzitzis are good for every single type of material. It won't necessarily teach me that the clothing is only chayiv b'tzitzis if it's made out of wool or linen. But from Tzaras, I learn now that clothing is only if it's wool or linen. That's Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak's opinion, and Rava argues on that. Fine. Amar Rav Acha Brei Rava Rav Ashi. Rava's son asked Rav Ashi. Based on 1 second. He's basically, I guess, coming to defend his father. He's coming to ask a question according to Rav Nachman. The Tanna Dvei Rabbi Shmuel. The way you explain Tanna Dvei Rabbi Shmuel, not you, the way Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak explains Tanna Dvei Rabbi Shmuel, that tzitzis, we learn that from Tzaras, that it's only if a clothing is wool or linen, you're chayiv b'tzitzis. However, by shrotzim, any type of material is chayiv, it becomes tummy. Why? Why by tzaras the merabi shar begodim? They say the other materials are also tummy. The chsiv oy beg. There's an extra word in the pasuk. Oy. Hachanami here also by tzitzis. Lema, let us say l'rabi shar begodim. Let us add other types of materials. Me asher techase. But there's also an extra word in the pasuk. It says any of your clothing which you cover yourself with. Obviously, I cover myself with it. What do I have the clothing for? So it's an extra word or extra words. So maybe it's coming to add any type of material that I cover myself with. Just like by shratzim, you have an extra word. And therefore that cancels out the binyan ab. Learning out from the goyim, do the same by tzitzis. What's the difference? Says the Gemara, no, you're right, it's extra words. But there's something else I learned out of those extra words already. Hahula suye, that is coming to add ksus suma, the clothing of a blind man who does is what it came for. Time you learned in Abraiso, Reisim, Oisu, the pasuk is about tzitzis, you have to see them. From that I learned out, Perat l'ksus laila. It's coming to exclude that a clothing either designated for the night or a clothing that you wear by the night, you don't have to put tzitzis. Says the Braisa, it's questioning itself. Ata Omer, you're telling me Perat l'ksus laila, it's coming to exclude the clothing of the night. Maybe not. Perat l'ksus suma. Maybe it's coming to exclude the clothing of a blind man. So he says, no. When the pasuk says, asher techasebo, there's an extra word telling me that more types of clothing are chayiv b'tzitzis than you would think. It's coming to add, it's coming to add the clothing of a blind man. Oh, but I have still a problem. How will I leave standing strong? Or the pasuk which is that you must see them. It's coming to exclude the clothing of a night. Why did you choose the Rabbi Sumo to add a blind man? And to exclude the clothing of a night? The answer is, says the Braisa, I will add the clothing of a blind man. Other people could see them. So it's being seen, not by the one who's wearing it, but by other people. I will exclude the clothing of the night. It's dark. I mean, it was pitch dark, no street lamps, not necessarily any candles at home. So it's a time that no one sees the tzitzis, or naturally, at least, no one sees the tzitzis. And since naturally no one sees the tzitzis, that's what the Torah is excluding by Re'isa Ma'isa. Okay, so that's the Braisa. Fine, so Nachman has no problem. He has a Braisa supporting him. That Asher Techasav was not adding Tzemer Upishtim. I'm sorry, it's not adding other materials. What do you call it?
Susuma.
Yeah. Why am I adding susuma and not other materials? The Braisa supports it. But why Takin? Why Takin? Why is the Braisa adding the ksus of a blind man and not other materials? Let us say that it's coming to add other materials. Says the Gemara Mistabra makes sense. The Torah is talking about wool or linen, either mitzvah the comparison to shatnez, or from what we learn out from tzaras. So the initial assumption is that we're talking about wool or linen. So when it's coming to add marbet semer upishtim, if I have a choice what it's coming to add, it makes more sense that it's coming to add another type of clothing from the same material made out of wool or linen. But koi b'tzemer upishtim, if it's made out of wool or linen, it's coming to add sha'ar b'godim, other clothes. In other words, although that is what we're doing in what do you call it, in shrotzim, that begit simply means wool or linen, and then there's an oy, and it's coming to add other materials. But then we have no other choice. What else would you add? But here that we have another choice. The choice is that it's coming to add another type of clothing of wool or linen. That's the first choice. It makes more sense that it's coming to add something which fits into the category that he's talking about, rather than adding a whole different category. Okay, so Rav Nachman Yitzchak still could pass the test. Tonin Rabbi Shmuel, according to him, holds that tzitzis is only chayiv, that which clothing is chayiv, but tzitzis is only wool or linen, but any material is tummy from shrotzim. How do we know that tzitzis is only on a clothing of wool or linen from tzaras? Shnotzim, I don't learn out from tzaras because there's an extra word, oy. But tzitzis is also an extra word, oy. I'm sorry, the extra word, asher techasivo. But from there we learn out that a blind man's clothes are chayiv b'tzitzis, which I would have thought otherwise because it says ureisim oisim. Why do I choose a blind man's clothing? Because that's wool or linen. It's included in what I started off with. However, to add something totally different, I try not to, unless I have no other choice. Okay.
So a blind man's clothing is only chayiv if it's wool and linen?
According to Rav Nachman, by Yitzchak. Just like any other person's clothing.
Uh-huh.
Everyone agrees that Rabbanan, every clothing is chayiv. So this question is b'deraisa, and it's a machlekes that paskim later also. Some say the halacha is like Rava, some say the halacha is like Nachman bar Yitzchak. So it's still a machlekes. Fine. So that's the end of the discussion of how to solve the two brises of Tanna Dei Rabbi Shmuel. So now we're going back to the original brisa we started off with, Reb Shimon ben Elazar. Reb Shimon ben Elazar, which said that anything but wool or linen is not tomei. The wording he used is not tomei by three etzbois. But he started off to say something else. He said like this: any material made out of wood, such as cotton or hemp, is not tomei by three etzbois, and you could use it as schach because it's not mekabel tuma. Only linen, which is tomei by three etzbois, and any linen, as we'll see soon, which would mean even just linen threads, or as Rashi will say, even linen, raw linen, not raw. How do you say? Just the when you just clean the fabric and you just make it ready to be spun into a thread. How do you call it? It's raw, but it's clean, combed and clean. It's ready to be spun. Yeah. So if you take, your word for it. If you just take that linen, soft linen, so that also cannot be used for schach. Cotton, yes. Hemp, yes. Linen, not. So till now we were focusing on the first statement about 3 by 3 etzbois in clothing that it becomes tomei by linen, not by other material. Now we're focusing on the schach. And the same Abaye that was trying to match Reb Shimon ben Elazar to other Tanoim is doing the same job now. He's trying to match him to other Tanoim. So he says like this: Amar Abaye, Reb Shimon ben Elazar v'sumchus amru davar echad, said the same thing. Reb Shimon ben Elazar had Amar, we said earlier that he said that we cannot use linen for schach. Sumchus titanya, we learned in Abraisa, Sumchus says, Sikcha b'tvi, if he took spun thread of linen, and he put it on top of the sukkah, although it's not a clothing, it's not mekabel tumah in most tumahs, psula. It's still not good for schach. Because it's a ras, it could still receive. Now, how does that fit with Reb Shimon ben Elazar, which said that pishtan in general he cannot use, which sounds that even if it just before it was even spun, it's also you're not allowed to use it for schach. So that's a question. Tosfos actually learns because of that unin do not mean just raw, as we'll see soon that we bring unin as well. Doesn't mean raw, just linen not raw, but linen that wasn't spun. It means spun linen. It's just a different name by linen than by wool. So really, Reb Shimon ben Elazar only spoke about spun linen. Yeah. Or you could say that it's a gzeira midrabanan. That midiraisa, if it's made into a thread, you cannot use it for schach. Chachamim were goyzer that even if it wasn't made into a thread, you cannot use it for schach. But they wouldn't have been goyzer that if they wouldn't have held that midiraisa threads are possible for schach. And that's why he holds the same as Sumchus is saying that these threads are possible for schach. Reb Shimon Elazar must agree to that from the fact that he said that even if it wasn't spun yet, you cannot use it for schach. It must be that he holds that if it was spun, then it's possible with deraisa. Says the Gemara, Kiman ki haytana. Sumchus, which goes the same opinion as Reb Shimon Elazar, is following this Tana. In other words, the fact that he says that linen that was spun is automatically mikabel tumas saras, not about schach. About schach, we matched Reb Shimon Elazar to Sumchus. The reason for schach is because it receives tumas saras, which only Sumchus mentioned that. Reb Shimon Elazar didn't mention that. Sumchus, which says that any linen thread can receive tumas saras, that goes according to a different Tana. Goes according to, as we'll see, Rabbi Meir. What does that mean? In other words, we would think, the Torah says that if it's Si or Erev, threads that are set up to the length, to weave the length of the clothing, or to weave the width of the clothing. They would have it like set up on two poles, these threads, and they would have those pedals, and they would press down and like it would switch the, what do you call it, the pick up the threads and put it down, and they would have this roll of Erev thread, of the thread which is meant for the length, and they would throw it in this way and that way, and that's how they would weave their clothes. So simply understanding the pasuk, you would say that it only becomes tummy once it's set up. But if I just wove it and it's just a ball of thread, I wouldn't think that it receives tumas negoim. But if the Sumcha says that it does. So who does he hold like? Kiman. Who does he go like? Kihai Tana, like this Tana. The Tanam into the Mishnah, Siva Erev, thread designated for the width or the length. Mitami bin Negoim is Mitami in Saras miyad. What does it mean miyad? Once you spun it, once you made it into a thread designated for the width or the length, as we'll see soon, that it was separate, they made separate, a different type, a different quality, different texture, the threads that were meant for the width or for the length. So, both of them, once you spun them, they already received tumas negoim. Rabbi Yehuda Eimer, no. Hashesi mishayashule. The threads that are designated for the length, you have to first cook them in order to clean them well. But the threads that are designated for the width, miyat, right? When I spun them, they're already mikabel tuma. What's the difference? Taisus are trying to explain over here. I don't really understand. They spun it in a different way, and one of them demanded that you should bleach it afterwards, and one of them didn't, and therefore one isn't ready until it was bleached. The other one is ready right away. Either it means just a bunch, the material before it was spun of linen is mikabel tumas negoy misha yislavnu from when you cook it, or it could even be that, or according to Tosfos, this means threads as well. That just by linen we call it unin, and by linen there's no difference between the si and the erev. They're all the same types of threads. Fine. So basically, what we said is like this: that Reb Shimon Elazar says that linen is possible for schach. So it sounds like any linen, no matter which stage it is, how much it was processed. That fits with Sumchus, which says that threads of linen are mekabel tumas tzaras. So obviously Reb Shimon Elazar holds like that as well. And therefore he holds that the Chachamim were geyser that linen, even before you made it into a thread, should be possible for schach. Who said that threads of linen are immediately possible for schach? You don't have to cook it first, you don't have to clean it first, just when it was spun, it's already possible for schach. That goes like Rav Meir. Rav Meir, which says that any threads are tummy right away, so he holds that they all tummy right away, and therefore you cannot use it for schach. Okay, so that was a small subject on its own. to match up a Tana to Reb Shimon ben Elazar's statement that linen is possible for schach, and to match up that Tana Sumchus that says that threads become tummy b'tzaras to Rabbi Meir. That's one way to explain it. Rashi is a different way to explain it, that we're matching him up to Rabbi Yehuda. We're not matching Sumchus up, actually we're matching Reb Shimon ben Elazar up. Reb Shimon ben Elazar, which said that any linen is pasur for schach, meaning even if it wasn't spun, that fits to Rabbi Yehuda, which Rabbi Yehuda mentioned unin shel pishton, which unin could mean, according to Rashi, that it wasn't even spun. Okay, that's that. Now we're going to the next Mishnah. It's a new subject. Till now we spoke about we mentioned in the first Mishnah actually different types of wicks and then different types of oils. And then we continued in more details in oil. And now we're continuing in more details in the wicks. Now, l'chayra is very interesting because the whole Gemara we had till now about linen would fit much more l'chayra in our prosta understanding after this Mishnah, which speaks about material made out of linen or other things of wood, the difference between them. Before, we only mentioned something in a far way similar. We mentioned that oil made out of wood you cannot use for candles. So we specified some things out of wood and other things out of wood are no good. And so from that we went to materials made out of wood. The difference between flax and other materials. It's interesting why this whole piece of Gemara came before this Mishnah, when l'chayra it would have fit very well with this Mishnah. Okay. So the Mishnah says like this: anything which is made out of wood, Madlikin, but you cannot use it for wicks for Shabbos. That's the only material that grows on something which is cold wood, and it burns well. Similar to that, any material made out of wood, in tumas oil, there's two types of tumas. There's the fact that everything under the oil, under the roof, is tummy, and that doesn't matter what it's made out of. Anything under any roof is mikabel tumah, if it's a roof with a mace. And then there is that the actual roof or the actual tent becomes tummy. And that only happens if it's a material, like a tent, if it's like a clothing, if it's able to be mikabel tumah. So if other materials which are made out of wood, such as cotton or hemp, is not mikabel tumah, if there was a dead person under it, then everything under the tent is mikabel tumah, but the tent itself is not mikabel tumah. But if it's made out of linen, it is mikabel tumah. Okay. Says the Gemara, 1 second. You're telling me a rule, an interesting rule. You're telling me that everything which is made out of trees, eitz, really I said wood, but usually eitz means trees. Something made out of trees or out of wood, whatever you want to call it, is not this, excluding pishtan. A pishtan is not a tree. It's a plant. Why are you calling it a tree? Why are you calling it wood? It's a plant. Minolan, how do we know the pishtan creates that flax is called wood? Amar Mazutra, the Amar Krot is a pasuk. When the two spies came to Yericho, they came to Rachav's house, so she took them up to the roof, and she covered them in pishtei ha'etz, in the flax stalks. So that means that stalks of flax are called wood, because they use the word eitz. So if the pasuk calls it eitz, we could call it eitz, it's eitz. So for that we know that the definition is that if the stalk is hard, even if it's not a tree that lasts from year to year, and there's branches from it, etc., it's just one stalk, but since it's hard, it's considered wood. Okay, we'll stop here. So, again, to summarize, we had the two brises of Talmud Vei Rabbi Shmuel. Whether we learn from the going to other things that only clothing out of wool or linen the halachos apply to, or the second Talmud Vei Rabbi Shmuel says that by shratzim, any materials mikabel tumah shratzim. How do we fit these two brises? Says Rav Nachman Bar Yitzchak, they're talking about two different things. The brise which applies from charas to other clothes is not talking about tumah, it's talking about which clothing is chayiv b'tzitzis, and The Braisa, which says oig beged, that any material is tummy, it's talking about Tumashrotzim, as it says clearly that any material could become tummy from a creature. Rava disagrees with that. Rava holds that any material is chai b'tzitzis. And the pasuk that says wool or linen is coming to teach us something totally different. That wool or linen threads can make any material potter if you put the threads from wool or linen. However, if it's any other material of threads, it has to be the same material as the clothing. Right? And then we asked a question. L'chaira, there's an extra word in the psukim of tzitzis. Asher techaseba, that you will cover yourself with. So l'chaira, just like by shrotzim, the extra word cancels out the comparison to tzaras. The same l'chaira shouldn't be in tzitzis. From asher techaseba, we add a blind man's clothing, which we would have thought not, because it says it's coming to add that. Why are we choosing a blind man's clothing over other materials? Because if it starts off with a certain material, it makes more sense that it will add something of the same material, not of a different material. And why do we say that a blind man's clothing is chayiv and night clothing is potter? Because by night no one sees, and a blind man, other people see his clothing. Then there was another halacha Reb Shimon also said that linen is possible for schach. And it sounds like any linen, no matter which stage it is. That fits with Sumchus, which says that linen threads are mekabel tumas negoim. So since threads are mekabel tumas negoim, and therefore the rights of the apostle for schach, comes Reb Shimon and says, therefore, I will say the midrabanon, even if it wasn't made into a thread, yet you cannot use it for schach. That we say that threads are mekabel tumas negoim fits with Rabbi Meir, that says that any thread is automatically mekabel tumas negoim. However, Rabbi Yehuda says that you have to first cook some of them to bleach them, to make them totally clean. Then we spoke about wicks for Shabbos candles, that only linen can be used for wicks for Shabbos candles. And then we said only linen, if it's made into a tent and it was on top of a dead person, it becomes tummy. Only linen and not anything else made out of wood. Why do we call linen? Why do we call flax wood? Because in Nevi'im, in Yeshua, it's called wood.